30 years ago, we had the idea that, China would be, as it became wealthier, it become more freedom-loving, more democratic, more part of the league, the world of nations that respected rule of law. And what we've seen is just the opposite. Under Xi Jinping, they've become more repressive, both at home, abroad. Through their Belt and Road Initiative, they've created a debt trap diplomacy that, we see that in Africa, we see it in the Americas. And so they've become much more aggressive in the South China Sea, threatening Taiwan, being ready to take Taiwan by force if necessary. And so we've seen them increasingly grow more aggressive. We've known for years that they've been investing in, more engineers, basically more STEM fields. And I can remember, 20 years ago hearing about the number of engineers that were produced by universities in China. And of course, we had universities collaborating very closely on research, even funded by our Department of Defense, Department of Energy. Now, what we've also learned, though, is that their dual-use technologies, their military-civil fusion, their national security laws have changed, just in the last several years, where basically any Chinese national, wherever they are in the world, is under the threat of, if they don't comply with whatever the CCP requires them to do, they are violating national security laws. And so you see this growing repression. And I would just say in the last week, with the critical minerals and their willingness to shut off basically, access to technology areas that we are dependent on in our military and our manufacturing, their true intent is really coming to the surface. And I would say in America, whereas when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, there was a Sputnik moment and suddenly it was all hands on deck in the United States. I believe in the last week we saw a threat economically, militarily, and basically showing the world what they're willing to do in order to advance their own interests. So I would say it's a huge wake-up call. I'm excited to be part of this committee that's working in a bipartisan way to try and address this threat.
You've called for urgent action in statements. What specific action would you want to see from the U.S., from our allies, on the rare earths issue in particular, and perhaps on other issues that are, as you say, are implied by their willingness to threaten kind of a strangling move of this degree?
Well, I think we need to view this not simply as a one-week strategy from China. I think we have to recognize they're going to continue to run this play over and over again. And so I've been advocating and have some bipartisan legislation that looks at the PNTR status, their permanent normal trade relations status. I think that should be revoked. I think we should not view them as a normal trading relationship. I also think when it comes to tariffs, if they're selling, different products that don't have high value technologically or sensitive technologies, obviously there needs to be some kind of, concern in terms of trade dependency, but really where we need to be focusing on critical minerals, AI, advanced technologies, hypersonic missiles, things that they have leverage in our supply chains. And I think we ought to be having a tariff up to 100% on those strategic. And I tend to be a free trader. I mean, that has been, my philosophy all along. But you have free trade with free nations. And when they are exhibiting the kind of subsidies, the kind of strategy that isn't simply to trade technologies and be part of a system. It's really to drive us out of business in different industries, and we've seen them run that play over and over again, and using subsidies, unfair trade practices, and we have to recognize that we need to have a corresponding treatment of them. And so I think the assumptions that we made years ago need to be reevaluated, and we need to send a strong message, and right now is the time to do it, because they are going to continue to run this play over and over again. The whole sale of chips, and I think, in my opening remarks, we talked about this rolling technical threshold that I think is a good strategy. I think we just have to recognize that our goal should not simply to be selling American technology to China. We need to recognize the national security threat. I do think it's important that we are the backbone of these technologies, AI, around the world, but I do think we can get there through a threshold that keeps them at bay. And it's going to be very important that we work with our allies, the Netherlands, Japan, and make sure that, we continue to have this lead in the game. A short-term victory, I come from an agriculture district, and of course, soybeans is something. We don't want to, we want to make sure our farmers are not harmed by retaliation, and we want to do everything we can to, support them. But at the same time, we would never want to trade national security for, more access to the Chinese market for soybeans. The $1 trillion investment, or whatever the amount was that was being floated as, we do not want America to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. To me, you look at what's happening around the world, and China is very strategic in terms of how they invest. I recognize there's a dependency right now on American businesses and our supply chains, but let's do everything we can to get out of that trap rather than deepening the dependency. And so, like in my district, I've been opposed to a Chinese battery plant, Gotion, which is a Chinese company. And, normally I'm all excited about jobs that would be coming into my district. But when you see that, Gotion, right in its articles of association, talk about its relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, when you recognize the national security laws that any Chinese national is under, when we've seen in Michigan, my home state, 5 students from the University of Michigan, Chinese nationals, caught outside of Camp Grayling, where they're training military leaders, including Taiwanese military leaders. And the Chinese national students are saying, well, we're here stargazing. Well, the equipment they had, and these students had some amazing equipment to look at the stars right outside of Camp Grayling. We've seen, Chinese nationals bringing in different materials, a fungus that could be used as sort of an agro-terrorist. And again, I don't want to look at every Chinese national in a suspect way, but we do need to focus on the fact that the Chinese government and the laws that the Chinese nationals are under put every Chinese national at risk and are vulnerable to leverage, they or their families. And so we have to really reset our expectations.
We've mentioned export controls on US-designed semiconductor chips. You and your team recently put out this report on semiconductor manufacturing equipment and the importance there, too, of export controls that would seek to prevent China from having the ability to indigenously manufacture in China the most advanced chips. How do you see that policy area? The second Trump administration has kind of adjusted the policy trajectory on the export controls of AI chips, but stated in places like the AI Action Plan a commitment to keeping export controls and tightening them on the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Is that the direction that you see coming likely from the Commerce Department and the White House?
I hope so. I do. I think that is likely. And it requires collaboration. Our investigation, we looked at ASML, the Dutch company. It looked at a Japanese company and 3 American companies. And what we learned is about half of their sales were into China. And not their highest technology, but it does show the interest in China, the commitment that they're making in this area. And we just have to recognize we need to stay ahead of that game and work with our allies. We've already met with some of the Dutch leadership, and we continue to work at those.
One of the most interesting things about that report, I thought, was that you mentioned actually that there are signs of Chinese-made semiconductor manufacturing equipment making inroads into the U.S. market and into semiconductor fabs that we have here at home. That would seem to raise a very interesting and I think important set of questions about not just export controls, which get a lot of discussion, but import controls, which actually don't get discussed much at all, not nearly as much as they should. Do you see, is there an opportunity for import controls, like from the Commerce Department's so-called ICTS authority, on that Chinese-made semiconductor manufacturing equipment? And do you think there might be an opportunity, really a need, for import controls in other areas when it comes to tech that would flow in here from China?
I do think that's very important. And I think when you think of like the CFIUS process, where we're looking at inbound investment, we got to be concerned about outbound investment. We got to be concerned about what's being invested here, and like that. And I can never remember the acronym, so forgive me for.
Yeah, it's painful.
But similar, we don't want to increase our dependency on Chinese technology and having more of our supply chain dependent on that. And so I do think there's a key role, and I think you're right that makes a lot of sense. I will say with the CFIUS process, we've had to continue to revise and update that because it's kind of a moving target, and I'm hoping within the Trump administration there will be opportunities to make sure we stay ahead of the game on this. We've done different reports on, drones and our dependence on drones, and law enforcement. You look at all these areas, like 80% of the drones being Chinese. We look at these cranes that are in our ports, and again, like 80% of these cranes are Chinese, and what we found is that there was a cellular modem on these cranes that wasn't part of the original specification, but the CCP was kind enough to put those so that they could monitor what's going in and out of our ports. When you look at some of these technologies, it's important that we don't further our dependence in this area, and we provide space for American innovation. I've talked to drone manufacturers that got out of the business because China was running the playbook where they said, we want to dominate in this area and we will undercut the price every way possible and drive them out of business. We've seen that with critical minerals, mining, processing, and so it really, whereas I'm very much in favor of free markets, there is a national security imperative that says we do need to have a supply of these critical minerals, and the government needs to step in and address these, situations.
It seems drones, cranes, other things that you and your colleagues have shined light on power inverters across the U.S., power and electrical infrastructure that, come from China, often are found with, rogue hardware that's transmitting home in ways that are not advertised. You had a colleague, Congressman Nunn, who did an open letter recently on the matter of these Chinese crypto mines that are operating all over the United States and not only have the ability to be surveillance platforms for China, but to sabotage the power grid wherever they are because they demand so much power. And this can be a vector of sabotage, including against the U.S. military facilities that are often next to these crypto mines.
Yeah.
It seems there is, very much to your point, an entire really long list of areas that affect kind of the U.S. consumer economy where the main instrument for getting at them is the hard-to-pronounce ICTS authority of the Commerce Department.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've seen how important that is when it comes to these, Volt Typhoon and some of these areas where our infrastructure is vulnerable. And again, it's they're playing a long game. It's not like their companies have to be concerned about, shareholders. They have the golden shareholder that, decides what the priorities are over whatever length of time and are, willing to do whatever it takes to accomplish their goals. And so you're right, those kinds of technologies coming into the United States, that's a huge concern.
Do you think that the components that go into U.S. data centers is one of them? Because it seems that one area of this piece, of this sort of China technology landscape that is often overlooked is how much of the hardware that goes into the U.S. AI build-out, which the administration is focused on making sure is dominant over China's AI build-out, actually comes from China. These are servers made from companies in China, and some of them are well-known, Foxconn and Pegatron and others, and yet, as a policy issue, it's not so well-known.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, and just to make it, even more accessible to everyday Americans, routers, right? I mean, the dominant position of Chinese routers, was it TP-Link? I mean, I'm trying to think of the name of it, but, it's so interesting. Our staff director, was, we were starting to discuss this issue and I'm thinking, well, I've got a router at home. I don't know what kind it is. And, he was saying, yeah, my mother had a router and it was TP. And you realize the infiltration there. And again, if it was a normal trading relationship with a friendly nation, you'd say, great, that's a win-win. But with the surveillance capabilities, these are just huge concerns. And when you look at the surveillance state that exists in China, that they are trying to export around the world and partner with dictators and oppressive regimes to prop them up as well. On one hand, they're saying, well, we're not involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but we know Russia would not be prosecuting that war were it not for China propping them up with all sorts of resources. So it's just a different day, and it's an opportunity for us as Americans to partner with like-minded countries and also continue to encourage American ingenuity and recognize that, we can compete with anybody, but we bought into this idea that China was going to be a reliable partner. And we just have to really re-examine that assumption.
Let's go from critical infrastructure on kind of the telecom, hardware, AI data center side to critical infrastructure on the sort of software and the minds of our children and voters side. What's your view of what we've seen in the news about TikTok and where the administration seems to be going on this divestiture arrangement?
Well, just the history of that, we passed that legislation in Congress. President Biden, I wish he had just let it go dark on January 19th, and we would not be dealing with the same situation. He basically handed President Trump a live grenade. Starting being sworn in. And so I give the Trump administration credit. They are trying to execute the law, keeping TikTok available, but also under American control. Everything, we've requested a briefing and are going to get a briefing on the latest in terms of this, negotiated deal. And I would say it's still very much a work in progress. The things that I've been concerned about are, I don't want to see ByteDance having control or even the algorithm. I think that needs to be controlled by, American interests. And, the legislation doesn't specifically preclude ByteDance from, up to 20% ownership. But I think we need to be very clear that we do not want their ability to control the algorithm. I've talked to some of and I'm not a technology expert, but when you hear the technology expert saying that in that algorithm, about half of it, they can't figure out what's in there. And to me, that just, I just believe you have to have a new algorithm. And I don't know that you can reprogram, or I forget how you phrase the term, but so I'm concerned about who controls it and also the algorithm. And, we just got to get the law implemented. To me, it's been amazing how much we've been able to see our taxpayer dollars, whether it's Department of Defense, Department of Energy, investing in research that is benefiting the Chinese military and their industrial complex. And so we have highlighted that, and we are trying to cut that off. And I think we're going to be successful doing that. A lot of universities have discontinued their joint partnerships with Chinese entities that are affiliated with the PLA. But Wall Street, and this is what makes outbound investment legislation difficult, is, they have a responsibility to their shareholders to make them money. And, they would say, well, we want to be patriotic, but their day job is to make money for their shareholders. And so we need to continue to highlight and make visible the fact that when you are putting American investor dollars investing in entities that partner with the Chinese military or the surveillance state, that is not a patriotic decision, and we need to have clear guardrails on what is acceptable and what isn't. And so my hope is with this outbound investment, we're looking at both sectors as well as entities, different companies. Now, what makes it difficult is these companies, it's like whack-a-mole. You sanction one company and they come up with another name and another. So you have to have both sectors as well as companies that, basically do not invest list. And of course, Wall Street wants clarity. And in this case, that's what we're working through the details. How do you give sort of the red light, green light, eliminate the ambiguity, but accomplish the task? And so that's what we're working on, and I'm confident we'll get it done.
And then we'll open it up. I'm curious, the Biosecure Act would seem to get especially at the challenge of things like Chinese companies tied to the Chinese state providing, gene sequencing services in the United States that pose an important threat to the sensitive data of Americans. But how do you think we're going, either in the Congress or in the administration, on the pharmaceutical and drug supply chain problem with China, which is related but separate?
Yeah.
I was surprised to learn recently, I hadn't been tracking, there's some awareness that there's something like an 85% or more dependency on China,
Yeah.
the advanced pharmaceutical ingredients of a lot of important drugs.
Yeah.
There's also something like a 90% plus dependence on foreign sources for biologic drugs, which is not so much part of the conversation. We've got a 232 process at the Commerce Department, other measures in the Congress. Do you think we're going to be getting at the danger of vulnerability to drugs that come from China with the speed that we need?
I think that's a huge, supply chain dependency. It's funny, until COVID hit, I don't think supply chain became sort of this, everybody understood the term and why this matters, because, it was always, let's buy it in the least expensive place, where can you manufacture it cheaply so that you get the lowest. But these dependencies that have been created, and it could be critical minerals, all these things. But medicines are right at the forefront of this. And, we saw during COVID, China was willing to restrict personal protective equipment and other things when it was in their interests. And, you think of the vulnerabilities, you mentioned the active pharmaceutical ingredient and the percentages, even in countries like India, where we do a lot, there's a supply chain dependency. So, some of the things are made here, some of the things are made here, and they rely on each other. And so, we've had some hearings on that. We want to get a complete picture. And then, once again, working with reliable allies. But China right now is in the midst of that supply chain. And it doesn't surprise me if they would start to leverage that similar to what they're doing on critical minerals.